How's it going, guys? Coach Weston here with Good Lift Performance. Today, I'm going to talk about a subject that is not talked about a lot, but I think is very, very important. In today's video, I'm going to talk about one of the main reasons why you're struggling to hit your next PR and how you can also use this concept to not only hit your next PR and continue making sustainable progress for the long term. So if you've been struggling to hit your next PR in powerlifting, this video is for you. But before we get into the video, make sure you hit that subscribe button. That really helps out the channel, as well as make sure to drop a like on the video. That also really helps this video and really helps the channel and helps me. So the secret to hitting your next PR, as well as continuing to hit PRs and making sustainable progress, is building momentum. So first, let's talk about what building momentum is. Building momentum is essentially stringing together multiple weeks of training in a row successively so that each week builds on the last week and will build you up and closer to that your next PR, or build you up to the end of the block where you can push the RPE, push the weight, and try to go for that next PR or the rep PR, or just a heavy weight of the block that will set you up to be successful in future blocks. Why building momentum is so important is because when we start to string multiple weeks together, they really start to build on each other. And what I mean by that is you can have one good week of training, right? And that will make you feel strong. You go into next week of training, you're going to feel a little bit stronger. And then if you can continue stacking those weeks on each other, you're going to feel stronger and stronger and stronger. Or that's how you should be feeling theoretically. What happens when you don't build momentum, when you break that momentum in training, is, let's say you do that first week of training, or say you do the first 2 weeks of the block and you feel really strong, and then you go into the third week, you go, hey, I feel really good, I think I can hit a PR, and then you just send it in that third week, whether that is a true 1 rep max PR, or maybe it's a big rep PR, something along those lines. Essentially, you push it before you get to the end of the block. You kind of prematurely break that momentum to go for a PR. And so you have these shorter stints without having these long durations of building. And so what that does is, yes, you might hit a PR or you might not, and so in the short term, that might be a short-term win, right? You might hit that rep PR, which is great. But what does that do on the back end? What that generally does is that's going to break your momentum. That's going to cause an excess amount of fatigue that's not supposed to be there at that point in the block. And so now that's going to make the rest of your sessions that week probably a little bit worse. That fatigue is going to bleed into the rest of those sessions, and if not just the next couple sessions, but maybe the next couple of weeks, especially if it's a squat or a deadlift PR. We've all felt it where after you go for a rep PR or an all-time PR in deadlift, you're pretty fatigued for the next couple of days, maybe even the next week or so. And so when you break your momentum for the sake of going for that PR, that really you might get that short-term win, but you're almost breaking the long-term win that could be a bigger payout if you had just been more patient and continued building instead of testing, which goes back to things I've mentioned in previous videos, right? Of spending more time building and not testing. And so it's really important to build momentum. And there's lots of different ways we can build momentum, which is essentially the progression scheme that we're going to use inside of a block, so that by the time you get to the end of the block, you're able to have a good performance or hit a rep PR or a all-time PR, or you're hitting a top end weight that is a good number for you, that shows that you're strong, that you'll be able to capitalize on in the next block. Because we don't have to end every single block with a PR to have it be successful. If it moves us in the right direction, then that's a very successful block. And not only is there momentum within the block from week to week, but what's also really important, which I think is even more important, this is for the sustained progress, is how do you build momentum from block to block to block? How do you string together blocks of training together? Because individual weeks that's the base of it, right? You have to be able to have a good week of training before you can have a good block of training. But once we have that week down, and then when we can build upon that week to have a good block, now how do we sequence blocks together? Learning how to build momentum from block to block, I think, is very, very important, and something that is not talked about enough, because it's almost overly focused on how do we build momentum within the block? How do you build momentum from week to week? Which arguably, yes, it is very important, right? You can't put the cart before the horse. But once we get past that point, how do we get that sustained progress? Because yes, well, if we can build a great block, that's great. But then if you can't capitalize on that block that you just did and carry it into the next block of training and continue that progress, then you're just going to be on this hamster wheel of basically doing the same thing over and over again. I know back in 2019, this is something that I was learning was, all right, I can make progress. I can go from point A to point B within a block, make progress. But then now how do I carry that progress into the next block? How do I continue that momentum? Especially when I was using an emerging strategies type of programming, that was something that wasn't abundantly clear, was how do you take that success from the first block and bring it into the next block? The assumption was it would just happen, but in reality, that didn't always happen. And a lot of times it felt like one step forward and two steps back. And so that's why I really am passionate about this in particular topic, is because that's something I had to learn the hard way, and something that's made my coaching a lot better is learning how to take that success from one block and carry it into the next block, and then continue to bridge those blocks together and create lots of momentum, not only from week to week, but from block to block. So conceptually, that makes sense, right? We want to have training that builds upon itself and that can carry progress from point A, not only to point B, but the C, D, E, F, G, and onwards, right? But how do we actually do that? So I'm going to go into examples of how to build momentum within the block, and then how to also carry momentum from that block into the next block and continue that into further training cycles. So when we're looking at momentum within a block, we're looking at weekly progressions of how do we get a lifter from the start to the end of the block so they can make tangible progress. It doesn't have to be an all-time PR or an all-time rep PR, but we do need to see tangible progress from point A to point B that we can then build upon the next blocks. Because especially, let's say we're starting a new training cycle, where a training cycle is multiple blocks put together. That first block of the cycle might not be your best weights of all time, right? But it should set you up to be successful in future blocks. So when we are looking at how to set up the progression from week to week, we want to have a literal built-in progression. And so another thing that I've learned about using program, where the training was exactly the same from week 1 to the end of the block, and then you would just allow adaptation to occur to make the progress, where you'd use the same reps and same RPE, and then if you were able to add weight, that showed progress. Versus when you have built-in progress, you're going to start off with lower RPEs, and then you'll build up in RPE. Or generally, you'll have maybe higher reps and build into lower reps, like maybe start off with a triple on your top set and then you build into a single. Or if it's a volume block, you might do the opposite, where maybe you start with some moderate reps and then you try to add reps and maintain the same amount of weight so that you're building volume. Either one of those can work. But essentially, there is a roadmap of how do we build progression from point A to point B, from start to finish within the block. And the reason it's important to have a progression built in and not just assume progression is going to happen is because it's human nature to want to see tangible progress, right? Most of us got into powerlifting because we are stuck with powerlifting because we like seeing the weight progression. We like being able to add weight to the bar and seeing how the weeks build upon each other. And so having that built into the program is very, very important. As well as an important point that Steve Denovi makes in some of his videos is that when you look at adaptation within a training block, a lot of the times it's the beginning of a block is mostly physical adaptations or adapting to the volume, where our body is getting used to the amount of work we're doing. And then on the back end of the block, towards the end, that's where the neurological adaptation happens, where we're really starting to gain strength. And so that also builds into why it's best to start off with generally lower RPEs and then build up into higher RPEs. If you've ever heard the emerging strategies talk on different response types to emerging strategies, you've seen that there's 3 types. One that's just linear progress, one that is you initially drop down, you get worse, and then you recover and get better. And there's one where there's no response and it's delayed until the middle of the block, and then you start making progress towards the end of the block. And I think personally that has more to do with generally those programs start off with the higher RPEs. So you're starting in the 8 RPE to 9 RPE range a lot of times, and then you hold that constant throughout the block. Some athletes are going to respond really well to that. Those are usually the linear progression, ones, but the athletes who get worse initially or have a delay are probably athletes who that week 1 destroys them. It beats them down, so they end up getting worse, right? Their performance drops. Then the second week they have to pull back on the weight because they are fatigued, and then they recover, and then they'll start coming back out of that hole and start getting better. Or it's maybe they don't see a decrease in performance, but it's fatiguing enough and stressful enough where they still have to recover, and so they don't see that adaptation happen until the third or fourth week, and then they finally come out of it. Versus if you were just to start with lower RPEs, build into those middle RPEs towards the middle or end of the block, you might have the same. You'll still see the same like time where they're going to hit that response in the middle of the block, but the difference is you don't get worse or you don't see any progress and then get better. You can have that built-in, you'll mimic that linear progress as the type A or the type 1 responder in the emerging strategy framework. And so I think that psychologically is way more beneficial to the lifter because they are now psychologically building momentum as well as physically building momentum where I see I'm making progress from week to week. I'm literally able to add weight to the bar every single week and make that progress. And so I think that that's really, really important for why we need to have a built-in progression and not just a static held from week to week program. Now that might work well for some athletes. I do have one athlete in particular who I do specifically use more of a static approach from week to week, but they start off the beginning of the block with a slightly lower RPE. Then the second week goes up to where they're going to hold it constant for the most part. Then that's weeks 2, 3, and 4, and then week 5 they hit their top end where they go up to like a 9 RPE. So it goes like 7, 8, 8, 8, 9. And that's personally what they prefer. They like that. It helps them get more practice with those heavy weights. But that's something we've adjusted to over time and something we've come to learn works well for that athlete. But that's not something I generally do for athletes because it's hard to do the same RPE for multiple weeks because you're going to want to add weight. And specifically, I've seen a lot where you have athletes who in that emerging strategies type framework where it's held RPE over the weeks, they're going to sandbag the first week anyway. They're going to undershoot before they get into the meat and potatoes of the week, and then they overshoot on the last week anyway because they want to send it. So they already have that built-in progression anyway. So if you don't build it in yourself, the athlete's going to do it anyway for the most part. So it's better just to have it built in, as well as not all lifters are going to respond to just a linear RPE progression. You might have to get creative with it, like maybe you'll peak RPE and then have it drop down in terms of like, let's say with squat and deadlift, when they correlate together, maybe squat goes 6, 7, 8 and then drops off for the last week on week 4, and deadlift goes 5, 6, 7, 8. So that squat and deadlift are peaking RPE or exertion on different weeks, so that it can help with recovery. That's an option. Or you might want to have the athlete, maybe they respond best to lower exertion, so you got to keep them in that like 4 to 6 RPE range for the majority of the block, but we still need to hit that heavy exposure, so it's like RPE 4, RPE 5, RPE 6, and then last week can be like RPE 9, so that, all right, we know we need to hit this exertion, but we know we can't recover from that or recover from a lot of 7 to 8 work in general, so we're going to keep it low and then build up on the back end. So there's lots of different ways we can go about doing that, and it all depends on the lifter and really figuring out what's going to work the best for them. But regardless, it's having a built-in progression system that we can take a lifter through from point A to point B within a block is very, very important. That allows us to build momentum from start to finish. It allows the athlete to feel progression and success of the block, which is huge psychologically, so they feel like they are progressing and having good training. So now that we have talked about building momentum within the cycle, and I know I gave a couple of examples there, but I didn't go over a lot of specific examples, and that's because we could sit here all day and talk about different progression models for athletes, but I gave a couple of examples of how you could do that. You have a basic progression, you have an early peak and drop, and then you also have a delay peak and rise, right? Now let's talk about how to build momentum from block to block to block. I equate it to, if you've ever played Mario Kart, you'll know that in Mario Kart, you can collect coins on the track, and every coin you collect, it allows you to increase your speed, and you max out at 10 coins. So once you hit all 10 coins, you're going as fast as you can. And the reason I mention that is, one, collecting each coin is like a week of training. The more weeks you collect, the faster and faster you're going to go in terms of that momentum. And so, and also when you look at the number, it's more than just 4 or 5 coins, right? It's 10 coins. And I think that's a good illustration mentally of, it's not just about building momentum within the block, which is probably gonna be 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks. It's about stringing together multiple blocks together, because it's realistically, you're not going to hit your best of your best performance just training for something for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, like just peaking within one block. That kind of conceptually makes sense, right? You want to put together multiple blocks together to reach your highest peak. That's why most template programs are 12 weeks long. That gives you 12 weeks of progressively ramping up, of building momentum to the competition. And so when like 12 weeks can be anywhere from 2 to 3 blocks, roughly. And so that's why it's very important to not only build momentum just within a block, but to be able to carry it over to the next block. Because if you aren't able to carry over a momentum, then you're going to take 1 step forward and 2 steps back, where once you deload or you start your next block, you could be your starting point could essentially be exactly where you started at the previous block. And so now you just spend that next block regaining all of the ground that you already covered in the previous block, but since you couldn't carry over the progress, you're essentially starting at the same spot. So you're just on this hamster wheel of, even though you make progress within the block, you're never able to carry it over, and so you're just repeating the same weights essentially over and over and over again. And so that's why it's really important to be able to carry momentum from one block to the next block. And so there's a couple different ways we can do that. And so one would be a wave loading strategy. So I'm not going to go super in depth on this. Steve Noe has a great video on this, but essentially a wave loading strategy is where you'll take the same basic, like let's say call it 4 week block, and you're going to repeat it again. And assuming that we have this built-in progression where it starts off low, builds up high, then we go into your second 4 week wave, and you essentially start the whole thing over again. But now that week 1 of the second block, you want to try to start at week 2 weights. Where, all right, now we're starting 1 week ahead of the previous block. Let's run that over again. Boom, we hit an even higher point at the end of the second block. Rerun it again for the third block. You can repeat and do the exact same thing. So you can do essentially the same 4 weeks 3 times over and just continually build up, come back down, build up, come back down, and then build up into a peak performance. And then you can either test, go into a meet, or just then deload and recycle that. And so that's kind of an easy way to build momentum from block to block and actually carry that over. You can also, if you want to do more of a traditional programming style where you have deloads in between each block, essentially what you would want to do is, so using a wave loading strategy, the volume is held constant, but we drop the intensity. Assuming that you're ending in like an 8 to 9 RPE range, and the next week of the block is going to be more like 4, 5, or 6 RPE, somewhere in that range. The volume is constant because repeating the same work, it's just a different intensity, right? So intensity drops, volume stays the same. What we can do is, if you're adding a deload in, generally what you're doing is you're dropping volume but maintaining intensity. And so what you would do there is have like a low, medium, and high block where, let's say we're starting off with sets of 8. You run that through that progression, and then you deload. You can stick to the same weights and then drop it down to sets of 6 and continue up. All right, we're going to start the next block with sets of 6, but we're using the same weight for the first week of sets of 6 that we used on the last week for sets of 8, and then we can continue that progression. And that way you can kind of work through percentage range there. And then maybe your top sets are, you have a triple that first block, then a double the second block, and then a single on the last block. Or maybe you just use a more recycling approach for the top sets where you keep it at a single and go 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 5, 6, 7, 8 again, and kind of use that wave loading strategy, except just for the top sets. So that's another great way where if we want to drop the volume but maintain / increase the intensity, you start off with a higher rep range for the first blocks, and then you slowly drop off the reps. You're generally going to keep the same amount of sets, and then that weight will just slowly increase. The average intensity just slowly increases each block. So that's another great way of doing it. If you remember from my very first video where I talk about the progression model for periodization, that would be like a great example of block periodization, or that phasic approach where we're going to be doing higher reps, middle reps, and then lower reps. versus if you're more in that advanced programming where you only respond to a specific rep range, that's probably where you're going to use that wave loading approach, where you are going to be more repeating the same reps or a small like cluster of reps, maybe like 5, 6, 7 range, and then just trying to work within that. Because also with wave loading, you could do, let's say, sets of 7 for the first wave. The second wave can be sets of 6, and then the third wave can be sets of 5. So it's slightly different reps across the block or across the cycle. It's different from block to block, but it still builds on itself and allows you to make progressions. You'd probably have to still have small resets within those because they're so close together versus doing like 8, 6, and 4s where you could probably just linearly increase it. But that's still the same, regardless if it's a linear increase or if there's a build up, come back down. That still allows for that overall progression from block to block. And so that's really important for putting multiple cycles together. You're essentially going to be doing the same exercises, the same sets, the same split for multiple blocks together. And then all you're doing is either changing the volume or the intensity, or maybe a little bit of both, across the blocks. But it's essentially going to stay the same for multiple weeks. And so that's going to allow you to get the most out of those exercises, out of that split, out of that setup, and really allow you to build momentum. Because all it takes is small little adjustments. Once you start to essentially stall out within a block of doing the same things over and over again, because that will eventually happen, all you have to do is make a small adjustment in either volume or intensity, and that's enough of a change to have progress keep going. Versus if you try to change everything from block to block, that's where you're going to have a really hard time carrying momentum from one block to the next, where you're going to hop on that hamster wheel and essentially just repeat the same progress over and over again because you're not able to carry that momentum. So those are a couple of examples of how you can start from point A and build it all the way to point Z in terms of building momentum throughout the weeks. You want to be able to stack multiple weeks, but also multiple blocks and really build up into a peak, into a top end. And then with that also, generally in my experience, I think that 3 blocks is the longest that you really want to try to stack blocks together. 2 to 3 is kind of that sweet spot. It just depends on the athlete. Some athletes are going to can't have sustained exertion for that long, and so 2 blocks for athletes who will hit that peak a little bit earlier versus most athletes can do really well with having 3 blocks in a row. 4 blocks becomes really hard to maintain with just having busy schedules because we're not full-time lifters, as well as I see more injuries happen when we go past that 3rd block. So 3 blocks seems to be the sweet spot there in terms of stringing together blocks together. You also might have heard of coaches and athletes talking about doing a soft peak or a not peaking as hard into competition versus peaking into the competitions that aren't as important versus peaking very hard into competitions that are very important, say like nationals or the Arnold, depending on the athlete. And so kind of another way you can conceptualize that is maybe for something like a local competition or a regional or something that is a lower tier meet for that athlete, they might only do like one peaking or one block to peak into that, or maybe 2 blocks, right? It might be that's the shorter peak. If it's a 3 block, normally a peak, maybe they might just do 1 to 2 into those smaller competitions, knowing we'll do this peaking strategy, but we're not going to do it as long. You'll still be in good shape for competition, but you're not going to be as maximally strong. Versus for our number 1 priority competitions, we're going to do that 3 block ramp up. It's going to be that 12 to 16 build up into competition where we're really trying to string together all those blocks together so that we can hit your highest peak performance. So that's kind of another way you can conceptualize why you would use those. So if you just have a smaller peak, it's 1 block. If it's a bigger peak, you want to do multiple blocks into that. And so to bring it all back to the very beginning of why this is so important for progress, as I mentioned, when we're trying to hit our next PR, it's important that we not only build momentum within the block, but multiple blocks. Trying to go for that PR in the middle of a block, especially that first block, is not going to be super successful, right? You're just, even if you can hit it, you're shooting yourself in the foot in terms of progress, where that's going to halt your momentum and it's going to create a downstream effect of where now we have to make adjustments on the back end. Versus if you just stay the course, stay patient, build momentum, have those multiple weeks and blocks of building, and really focus on building up into the long picture and build up into that 3rd and final block, or maybe it's the 2nd block for you, That's where you're going to be able to not only hit your best PR, but when you can string together multiple blocks, that's where you're going to be able to create sustainable progress for the long term. So hopefully you found this video useful. This is one of my shorter videos, but I wanted to just talk about this concept because I do think it's super important, especially the momentum from block to block, because that's something earlier on in my coaching career that I didn't fully understand. And then once I understood it, I was really able to get a lot of my athletes to make lots of progress and lots of sustainable progress. So it's very important. I think it's a very important topic that isn't talked a lot about in coaching development content. So if you like the video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly in-depth powerlifting content. And I will talk to you guys next time. Peace.